Professor Harilal, Professor Godwin, Professor Thomas Isaac, Professor Joes, Professor Joseph, Comrades Dasivan Pillai, distinguished guests, students, members of the faculty. First of all, I'm very grateful that I have been given this opportunity. There are many occasions on which I have spoken in this hall, but never any occasion on which I have had such a distinguished audience that I have spoken to. So naturally, I have a certain trepidation in addressing the questions which I am supposed to. Professor Harilal referred to very fundamental political changes which are taking place in the world today, but also at the same time, along with these political changes, you also have the other side of the picture, namely that within the advanced capitalist countries, there is a shift towards fascism in order to deal with the kind of political challenges that capitalism is currently facing that Professor Harilal referred to. And I think this is an extremely dangerous situation, particularly made dangerous by the fact that in a country like France, since the end of the Vichy regime, before before Hitler actually marched into France, you have never had a far-right government, a fascist government, which everybody is expecting would be in place on 7th of July, led by Marine Le Pen's party. And at the same time, there are many other countries which are going fascist, particularly in Europe and of course elsewhere, even in the third world, in our own country. So the dangerous shift towards fascism is something which really is a cause for extreme concern. I'd like to devote a little bit of time to it before I discuss other issues, and particularly the challenges which this poses before the democratic forces of the world. That basically I believe that while of fascism in non-political terms, they see it essentially as a group of people who hijack democracy and so on, that is essentially political. In our own country, the talk is about, Rath Yatra and this and that, promoting the kind of fascist growth that took place here. I believe there is a very deep economic reason behind the emergence of fascism all over the world. And that what we see today, the global emergence of fascism, is in fact the limit point of the hegemony of global finance capital. In other words, the denouement of the hegemony of global finance capital is the emergence of global fascism. Why do I say this? I say this for two very obvious reasons, and they are interconnected. The first is that global finance capital has actually emerged at a time when you have nation states at a political level, when you have the working class movements in virtually every country arranged on political, within nation states, the political arrangement, the trade union arrangement, they're all confined to the nation state. You don't have an international working class. So you have a situation where capital is globalized, but the classes that capital confronts are not globalized. They are still arranged at national level. Now, this has a number of implications. For instance, one very obvious implication is that in the United States, the trade union movement is so greatly weakened that according to a calculation made by Joseph Stiglitz, the real wage of an average male American worker in 2011 was marginally lower than 1968. And this is something which stick to that conclusion. He said, absolutely. So the point is that, in the United States, and why is that the case? That's obviously the case because capital is mobile. If the American workers in any factory decide to go on a strike, then the capitalist would in fact move his plant to Indonesia, to Malaysia, to India, to wherever. So that is used. I mean, that's a very special case of what Marx had written about, namely centralization of capital is something which is invariably acts unions within the 10 factories have a coordinated arrangement between them, then of course you'd have a situation where the capitalist in any particular fact, the capitalist would be able to confront strike action in any particular factory. So the globalization of capital, which is an expression of centralization of capital, is one which actually has hit the trade union movement hard, even in the advanced capitalist countries. Now, if that is the case, then you may think that because of this, there should be a strengthening correspondingly of the trade union movement here, because if capital is shifting to the third world countries, then of course rate of industrialization goes up, the labor reserves get used up, therefore the tightness in the labor market, and therefore the trade unions here should be becoming stronger. As a matter of fact, that is not the case. In fact, once I had gone to a meeting in Barcelona where there were some Spanish trade unions. They had invited me, and I talked about unemployment in India. They were absolutely flabbergasted. They said, "You have unemployment in India? We thought we have unemployment because enormous reserve armies of labor that you find in the global south do not get exhausted. On the contrary, they actually get replenished. That is, a proportion of what you may call labor reserves to the total workforce is something that actually rises, if anything, and that's before the crisis has begun. In other words, this is something which you find secularly in the period of neoliberalism, which is the period of hegemony of international finance capital, because neoliberalism is the policy that is pushed and advocated by international finance capital. Now, why is that the case? That's obviously the case because under a neoliberal regime, because there's competition between countries in selling goods, you actually find that there is a far more accelerated rate of technological innovation, which raises the rate of growth of labor productivity. If you don't raise the rate of growth of labor productivity, in that case, your markets would be snatched away by the East Asian countries and so on. So there's a competitive struggle between the different countries to increase the rates of growth of labor productivity and to raise the rate of technological progress. Now, this is something which is quite often considered to be a very good thing. You find politicians saying, "Oh, it's wonderful that we're having such technological progress, high rates of growth of labor productivity," and so on. But on the other hand, what this means also is that employment does not increase correspondingly. That the rate of growth of employment is just the difference between the rate of growth of output and the rate of growth of labor productivity. So even if you have high rates of GDP growth, like in India, it is claimed we have high rates of GDP growth, though many people like Arvind Subramaniam have been arguing that that's exaggerated, that the actual rate of GDP growth in the recent period has not been anything more than 4.5%. But let's accept the government statistics that show that an accelerated rate of GDP growth has taken place. But if you find a high rate of labor productivity growth, then that is something which actually would tend to work against the increase in employment. This, by the way, is also true of China. What is considered the elasticity of employment with respect to output. That means if you have a 1% increase in output, how much is the percentage increase in employment is remarkably low. In China is estimated to be 0.08. That means that you really do, if you have a 1% increase in employment, in that case you have a 0.08% increase in if you have 1% increase in output, you have 0.08% increase in employment. So virtually, despite manufacturing output growing very rapidly in China, service sector output growing very rapidly in India, you actually do not find employment growth anywhere to a corresponding extent. And what is more, in India certainly, and in many third world countries, most third world countries, employment growth falls below the rate of growth of population, the rate of growth of the workforce, which basically means that the labor reserves increase. Now, I'm not saying that there may not be individual countries, individual small countries to which a lot of capital comes, and therefore you actually find that they use up their labor reserves and so on. But this is something which is not a general phenomenon for the global south. Now, if this is the case, then you find that in the global south, wages continue to remain stuck at a more or less subsistence level. And in the global north now, wages do not rise either because of the globalization of capital. As a result, the average level of wages in the world really do not rise to any significant extent. In fact, if you look at statistics, the country where you have had very notable increases in wages is China, where the increase in wages has been an administered increase because of the government decreeing an increase in wages. If real wages don't increase, but you have labor productivity rising, then of course you have the share of surplus rising in world output. And a rise in the share of surplus occurs not just at the world level, it occurs even at the level of individual countries. Therefore, if you take the world as a whole, there is effectively during the period of globalization, which is the period of hegemony of globalized finance capital, there has been a shift from wages to surplus. Now, there's nothing new about this. I'm simply providing an explanation for it, which is different, though the matter itself has been noticed above all by Thomas Piketty and his team, because they talk about an enormous increase that has taken place in inequality. But the implication of this is, of course, that this gives rise to what economists would call an ex-ante overproduction crisis. That means not necessarily an actual overproduction crisis, but it is a tendency towards overproduction because the propensity to consume out of wages is much higher than the propensity to consume out of surplus. Therefore, if you have a shift from wages to surplus, then there is a tendency towards overproduction. This tendency may be kept in check by John Maynard Keynes thought that this tendency should be kept in check through state intervention. As a matter of fact, this tendency has been kept in check in the current world conjuncture because of the asset price bubbles in the United States. In the 90s, there was the dot-com bubble, and subsequently when the dot-com bubble collapsed, Alan Greenspan, who was then the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board in the United States, lowered interest rates and, of course, generated a housing bubble. But with the collapse of the housing bubble, no similar bubble has taken place. John Maynard Keynes thought that state intervention could, in fact, provide that kind of, could counter the ex-ante tendency to overproduction, to prevent the ex-ante tendency from becoming an ex-post tendency, from getting realized. In fact, as you know, John Maynard Keynes was extremely worried. I mean, he was writing in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, extremely worried that unless this is done to the working class, if the levels of unemployment which the Great Depression saw continued, in that case, the working class would actually take the Bolshevik solution. Therefore, to preserve capitalism, he found it absolutely essential that the capitalist countries should bring down their rate of unemployment, and this he thought, and you should reach full employment according to him, which actually he thought could be done through state intervention. But state intervention in a period of hegemony of globalized finance is really out of the question. For reasons I don't have to go into, globalized finance is opposed to fiscal deficits, invariably opposed to fiscal deficits. During the gold standard years, the fiscal deficit that each country maintained was supposed to be 0% of GDP. Nowadays, the fiscal deficit that most countries maintain is allowed to be 3% of GDP. In our country, 3% center, 3% states. But basically, if you look at the European Union, 3% of GDP is the fiscal deficit you're allowed to maintain. Why finance is opposed to fiscal deficit is a very deep question on which I don't want to go into in this lecture. But the point is, anyway, most countries now have fiscal responsibility legislation, which is symptomatic again of the hegemony of finance. We don't have legislations that say a minimum 3% should be spent on health of GDP. We don't have legislations that say a minimum 6% should be spent on education as a proportion of GDP. But we do have laws that say that a certain percentage should, more than a certain percentage, should not be spent as fiscal deficit. Why is that? That is actually the hegemony of globalized finance. Now, if fiscal deficit is therefore limited, you cannot just raise the fiscal deficit and finance larger government expenditure by raising the fiscal deficit. At the same time, taxing the capitalists and taxing the rich is also out of the question, because of the fact that that is something that finance capital automatically would oppose, because that pinches them. As a matter of fact, you would know that during the Biden administration, Janet Yellen, who is the current Treasury Secretary, proposed that there should be a minimum corporate tax rates that countries should agree on. And they suggested 25%. No country agreed, although, most countries did not agree to it, and therefore they only settled on a 15% tax rate, which is below the existing tax rates anyway in most countries, existing corporate tax rates. So the point is that taxing the rich, taxing the capitalists is, of course, out of the question, again, because of the hegemony of globalized finance capital. That really leaves the only option of raising government expenditures would be through taxing the working people, workers in the advanced countries, workers and peasants in countries like ours. But the point is that if you tax them, then that doesn't, and spend that proceeds, then it doesn't add to demand. If the government spends 100 rupees and raises the 100 rupees in the form of taxes from working people who more or less spend all what they earn, then you find that there is very little net addition of demand. Therefore, the ability of governments to intervene in the manner that John Maynard Keynes had visualized is something which is really out under the current conjuncture. Therefore, we have this situation of crisis which is there in the world economy. As a matter of fact, if you look at the decade before the onset of COVID-19, was the decade with the lowest growth rate since the lowest decadal growth rate since the Second World War. And if you look at the European Union in particular, you find that the European Union has remained virtually stagnant in terms of per capita real income during this entire period from 2010 onwards. So, given this, therefore, there is a very serious crisis. Now, this crisis is something, we also see the consequences of this crisis, which manifests itself not just in terms of stagnation, but also in terms of unemployment, over and above the unemployment that I was talking about during the heyday of neoliberalism. I was saying under the neoliberal regime, the rate of growth of employment falls short of the rate of growth of the labor force. As a matter of fact, in a period of crisis, the rate of growth of unemployment, rate of growth of employment falls even shorter of the rate of growth of the labor force. That's why we have the unemployment crisis in our country and also elsewhere, including in the European Union. Periods of unemployment are really periods that are conducive to the growth of fascism. And that's because of the fact that these are periods in which you have monopoly capitalists getting worried about a challenge to their hegemony that would arise because of unemployment, exactly what Keynes had anticipated. And they try to meet this challenge by forming an alliance with neo-fascist elements, with fascist elements, which always exist in any modern society. So the point is that fascist elements exist. I mean, Jean-Marie Le Pen's political party, National Front, existed in France for decades. But the point is that this is a period in which monopoly capital enters into an alliance with the fascist elements. And in fact, in France, it's very clear because the media, the biggest media baron in France, who is called the Rupert Murdoch of France, is the one who's actually not only financing Marine Le Pen's party, but what is more, is making sure that Marine Le Pen's party gathers around itself all the conservative forces, some of the Gaullist elements in France in order to really capture power. So this is something which you find everywhere, this you find in our country as well. Now the question is, why finance capital or globalized finance and its local offshoots enter into such an alliance is something which is not difficult to fathom, because this is something which, first of all, divides the working class, because the main symptom of fascism is to other a hapless minority, and therefore you divide the working class in terms of Muslim, anti-Muslim. You divide in terms of immigrants, non-immigrants, in terms of blacks, non-blacks, and so on, so that you actually other a small hapless minority and generate hatred against that minority. That's the primary symptom of fascism. That changes the discourse, the intellectual discourse in the country. That also has the effect of dividing the working people, dividing the challenge that actually could be launched against the hegemony of capital. So it's not, and of course, it is authoritarianism which suppresses the trade unions and so on politically, and it is something which is invariably, therefore, associated also with the generation of a personality cult. In different countries, this generation of a personality cult has reached different levels, but nonetheless is one of the features of fascism. So the fact that fascism comes as useful for monopoly capital, particularly in a period of crisis, is not something which is very surprising. But the question is, why doesn't the working class put up a fight against this emergence of fascism? I think that's a very important issue. The German philosopher Walter Benjamin had analyzed the development of Hitler, I mean the rise to power of Hitler, as coming on the backs of failed revolutions. In Germany, you remember in 1918 there was a revolution which took the lives of Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. Then in 1920s there were several attempts at revolutions in Germany. And so his argument was that fascism rose on the backs of failed revolutions because the working class had got exhausted by these failed revolutions, and therefore Hitler could come to power. Now, of course, we have had no failed revolutions, and what is more, in the post-war period, there have not been any failed revolutions. But the enfeeblement of the working class is something which has been made possible because, again, of the neoliberal policies which have been pushed down the throats of most countries because of the hegemony of globalized finance capital. The enfeeblement of trade union movements because you have globalized capital confronting nationally organized workers is something I've already talked to. The fact that there is a rise in the labor reserves is something, relative size of the labor reserves I've already talked to. But there are many other features of neoliberalism that actually weaken the working class. One very important feature is the privatization of public sector assets. The working class is much better organized in public sector enterprises than it is in private sector enterprises. According to one American figure I have seen, about 33% of public sector workers, and that includes the education sector, are unionized, while in the private sector it's only about 7% which is unionized. One of the reasons why in France you have a very powerful trade union movement still surviving is because quite a significant sector of the French economy still continues to be under public ownership. Now, if that is the case, then of course privatization is something which would necessarily lead to a weakening of the trade union movement. And this is something that we actually do find. So, the hegemony of finance capital, globalized finance capital, really ushers in fascism, or if you like, leads to a denouement, which is globalized fascism, in two very obvious ways. One, that it leads the country, it leads the world economy and individual countries to a structural crisis from which they cannot escape, not a cyclical crisis, not a periodic crisis, but in fact a structural crisis from which they cannot escape. And secondly, it also weakens the working class, because of which it becomes both necessary and possible to have the emergence of fascism, because the working class resistance or the working people's resistance is something which is thereby enfeebled. And this is something which we have been finding. Against this, what can be done? Because I think this is something which is now taking, is really priority in terms of Europe. And of course, even in the case of the United States, it's very likely that Donald Trump is going to come to power. Now, the point is that there is, sometimes there is a feeling, a mistaken feeling, that as a matter of fact, when you look at the fascists, they are not the ones who are most hawkish, let us say, on Ukraine. That maybe the fascists are actually interested in peace. That actually, if anything, Donald Trump is supposed to be close to Russia. And therefore, if Biden goes and Trump comes, then even though Trump may be a horrible man, you can at least have some prospects of peace as far as Ukraine is concerned. All that, I regret to say, is not true, because when the fascists come to power, they make an about turn and actually pursue all the policies of aggression, which basically imperialism has been pursuing all these years. This is true of Meloni in Italy, who got elected on the basis of a certain kind of distance from monopoly capital, but having got elected, she is actually doing exactly what monopoly capital wants her to do. And this is also true of Marine Le Pen, whose party has already, before the second round of elections in France on 7th July, has said that, look, I mean, on Ukraine, we are with you. In other words, we don't have any separate views. And Donald Trump actually gave more aid to Zelensky than even subsequently Biden did, because, you know, I mean, everything said and done, there is a certain interest of capitalism, particularly of imperialism, which of course fascism protects, and therefore there is no hope of peaceful fascism in any case, or an end to the kind of wars that we have been seeing. Now, in the third world, this is going to be particularly serious, not just because the tendency to fascism is a global tendency, but also because of the fact that in a period of crisis, the debt of many third world countries increases, because obviously your exports don't grow as rapidly as they would otherwise have done, but your imports continue to be downward inflexible. That being the case, your debt tends to increase. And as your debt tends to increase, I mean, third world debt is now an extremely serious issue. You have to, as long as you remain within the neoliberal framework, within the framework of relatively free commodity trade and financial flows, capital flows, including financial capital flows, you will have to then manage these resources by borrowing internationally, by reaching deals with your lenders to postpone your repayment obligations, and to do all that you have to accept certain conditionalities. And these conditionalities typically are completely loaded against the working people. This is something which we have seen even in our neighborhood. I mean, you look at a country like Sri Lanka or a country like Pakistan, they are really countries in which the debt burden is one which actually has made the governments accept all kinds of anti-people, anti-worker conditionalities. And this has nothing to do with whether the government is good or bad, whether they want to be kind of ruthless or not vis-a-vis the peasants. They simply have no option. Now, it is in this context that the weakness of contemporary fascism. So what I'm trying to suggest is that therefore it becomes possible to mobilize large masses of people, of workers, of peasants, and so on, all over the world, but of course located in particular countries, against fascism. And this is something which becomes also possible for a particular reason. Namely, that exactly the inability of the liberal bourgeois state to find a solution to the ex-ante overproduction crisis that Keynes thought it could is something which is true also of a fascist state. Because even a fascist state, after all, is a nation state. You still have globalized finance and a fascist nation state. One of the reasons why Hitler, or for that matter Japan, which was the first country to come out of the Great Depression in 1931 itself, could manage to come out of the Depression is because they, of course, stepped up military expenditures financed by borrowing, which is what we call a fiscal deficit. So a fiscal deficit could be sold by Hitler to his national finance capital, by the Japanese military fascists to their national finance capital, because of the fact that it was still national finance capital. But the moment you actually have globalized finance, then even a nation state that is ruled by a fascist government would be as incapable of resolving the crisis as any liberal bourgeois nation state would. Therefore, the kind of support, social support, that fascists could mobilize in the 1930s, the kind of classical fascism could mobilize a certain amount of social support, is not something that contemporary fascism can mobilize. And it is this which together with, as I said, the worsening in the conditions of the working people, really allows the possibility of building up a resistance. Contemporary fascism is precisely because it is not occurring, as Lenin had said that time, in the midst of inter-imperialist rivalry leading to wars. Contemporary fascism is not likely to burn itself through a war, burn itself through an inter-imperialist war and so on. It is something which has to be fought and locally overthrown by the people of the country itself. But insofar as you may get rid of a political fascism, but on the other hand, as long as the economic crisis remains, as long as the conjuncture that produced fascism remains, they would come back to power, exactly as is happening with Donald Trump. Donald Trump had been voted out and everybody had heaved a sigh of relief, but again he is currently the front runner in the US presidential elections. And the same would happen elsewhere as well. Therefore, to get rid of contemporary fascism, it is important that you have to get rid of the conjuncture that produces fascism. And this conjuncture is one which I said is characterized by the crisis of neoliberal capitalism. So you have to overcome the crisis of neoliberal capitalism. You have to overcome the debt crisis of the third world, and you have to have a mobilization of classes that actually pursues an economic agenda which is a different one from the neoliberal economic agenda. Now, this is not at all easy. This is not at all easy because any alternative agenda is something which, because it goes against the interests of globalized finance capital, it would come down like a ton of bricks on any such alternative arrangement. As a matter of fact, you would have sanctions being imposed against you. Harilal referred to the sanctions against Russia. Sanctions against Russia, paradoxically, in fact, one of the paradoxical situations at this moment is that precisely because of the fact that US-led imperialism is beset with all kinds of challenges, the sanctions against Russia ended up strengthening the Russian economy than weakening it. Because you actually find that it is Europe that was reliant upon Russian gas, which is now suffering. And of course, to some extent, it is actually clandestinely importing Russian gas through India. But the point is that it is Europe who's suffering. But on the other hand, in Russia, there is no such kind of, breaking of backs as had been predicted. As a matter of fact, quite remarkably, the moment the sanctions were announced, the ruble actually went up. It came down subsequently, but certainly the slogan which was provided at that time, that we shall destroy the ruble and reduce it to rubble, is something that actually has not happened. Now, this actually also holds out a certain hope for the resistance. I know that the moment you wish to de-link from the hegemony of globalized finance capital, there would be all kinds of pressures on you. Two questions arise. First, how do you deal with those pressures? The way to deal with these pressures, of course, is that there must be substantial social support domestically. And that substantial social support can actually be obtained only by having an alternative economic program, which is a program of direct benefit to the people. As a matter of fact, a program of enlarged government expenditure, which actually provides healthcare, which provides education, which provides employment, and it provides education, healthcare, and so on free of cost to everybody, is something which is absolutely essential, at least to make the intent of the government clear and therefore to retain the support of the mass of the people. And this, of course, should be, in my view, done not as a charity on the part of the government that we are giving you free health care, but it should be done as a right. I believe that every citizen, certainly in India, but I would generally suggest, should have a justiciable, universal economic right, exactly like we have justiciable, universal, constitutionally guaranteed political rights for free education, free health care, for food, for employment, universal employment, and of course for old age, non-contributory pensions and disability benefits. We made some calculations on this, and it can be financed by simply having two taxes imposed on the top 1% of the population. I'm talking about Indian data. And that is a wealth tax of 2% and an inheritance tax of 1/3, both imposed on the top 1% of the population, which currently, according to Piketty's estimates, owns 40% of the nation's wealth and 24% of the nation's income, of the national income. So just two taxes. I'm glad to see that these days now many voices are talking about wealth and inheritance taxation. These are the best ways of financing such a larger government expenditure. This, of course, would be anti-neoliberal. This goes beyond neoliberalism. But on the other hand, it would actually generate substantial social support for a program that goes beyond neoliberalism. Secondly, at the level of the issues that Professor Harilal was raising about the dollar. Now, it is obvious that the dollar is not going to be replaced by any other currency. In fact, in my view, the dollar should not be replaced by any other currency. We don't want, just as we don't want dollar hegemony, we do not want yuan hegemony, we do not want any hegemony of any other currency. I believe the future should be one in which a number of small countries more or less come together and have agreements among them in order to constitute, if you like, economic units. Like the European community is an economic unit, you could actually have Central African community, which can be an economic unit, South Asian community, which can be an economic unit, and so on, within which trade deficits can be settled by using their own currencies, much the way that we used to have with the Soviet Union in the old days, where you had the rupee arrangements, rupee-ruble arrangements. The exchange rate between the rupee and the ruble was fixed. And of course, if you had a deficit, then the deficit remained, but over a period of time, you sold enough goods to make good the deficit. In other words, local arrangements, not an international arrangement that replaces the dollar hegemony by some other reserve currency's hegemony, is what I would advocate. I am completely opposed to free trade. Let me make it very clear. I believe all theories of free trade are bogus theories. You look at Ricardo's theory of free trade. Ricardo's theory of free trade argues, I mean, it gives an example about England and Portugal trading, where England sells cloth to Portugal, Portugal sells wine to England. The presumption behind that theory of comparative advantage is that both countries can grow both commodities. But England cannot grow wine. It is simply not possible for England to grow wine. As a result, all the theories that argue that trade is mutually beneficial, free trade is better than, I remember teaching all this in my kind of salad years, free trade is better than restricted trade trade is better than no trade, and so on and so forth. Completely bogus. But the point is that, of course, I'm not saying we should not trade, but on the other hand, trade should be based on an actual evaluation of the advantages to particular countries, not that they get locked into particular situations of specialization. Therefore, I would really suggest that a welfare program financed by wealth and inheritance taxation that goes beyond the kind of neoliberal limits, and at the same time, local trade arrangements that break the hegemony of the dollar are the way forward. Of course, what steps you take, how you go, are issues that I would not go into. But that is absolutely essential because, and that requires obviously the support, a kind of social support that can come from the working people, which is absolutely essential for going beyond neoliberalism. And at the moment, neoliberalism, which is the preferred, which is the policy that is thrust by globalized finance capital on the entire world, has pushed the world to a situation where wars are going to become intensified, where fascism is rising its head, but where the crisis continues, people's suffering continues. We have to go beyond this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Prabhat. I think all of us would agree that this lecture has given us